What you'll have to do is indulge me for this week. I will get through half of the reign of Justinian. What I plan to do is get up to the end of the Nika Riots, where everything is cleared away and he's ready to start on his grand career of reconquest and catastrophe. And I'll do that next week. But what I will do this week is the long 5th century and the beginnings of Justinian. And I think it does fit in rather well, but the slides are a little rough and ready, and I'll have to tart those up in various ways. Here is an image of Justinian I, the greatest, or perhaps just the best known of the Eastern Roman or Medieval Roman or the Byzantine emperors. He reigned from 527 to 565 AD. This image is not from within the normal territories of his empire. This is from the mosaics in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna in northern Italy, which at the time, of course, was part of his empire, but it was not what you could call the core territories of his empire. But let's go through the basic facts of his life. He's born in 482 in the Balkans, in the territory of what used to be Yugoslavia, which at the time was an overwhelmingly Latin-speaking part of the empire. Born into a rather humble background, but hardly at the bottom of society, let's say that he was born into the respectable middle classes. It's because of that that he was able to acquire a very good education. He was perhaps the last ruler whose native language was Latin. He is a very controversial ruler. Some people, ever since within his own lifetime, have seen him as a ruler of matchless glory. He carried the empire to a peak that no subsequent ruler was able to match. On the other hand, there is a line of opinion which again dates from within his reign, which regards him and everything he did as a disaster. It is arguable that his reign involved the empire in actual and contingent embarrassments from which it took well over 150 years to recover. It could be argued that he was simply unlucky, and that is a case that I'll make next week. What we can say about him, though, is that he is the most notable commissioner of buildings in the entire history of the Eastern Empire. The great church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul dates from his reign. He commissioned it, he approved the design, and he was there at its consecration. He presided over, without necessarily having contributed to, one of the empire's ages of literary greatness. You have Procopius, but also Agathias and other writers. He oversaw the consolidation of Roman law. This is an achievement of undeniable value and brilliance. Roman law, rather like the English common law, had grown up over the course of the last 1,000 or so years. Cases, opinions of legal scholars which amounted to the force of law, legislation of various kinds by the emperors. You have 1,000 years of this, and it has grown vast and chaotic. Various attempts have been made to collect and to harmonize this immense body of legislation and of jurisprudence of every kind, but no serious work has been done. Justinian appointed a legal commission headed by a scholar called Tribonian, which managed to summarize and to harmonize the entirety of Roman law. This was published in Latin and translated into Greek, and although in the short term, although for the next 4 or 5 centuries indeed, it had no particular influence in the West, it was eventually rediscovered and spread over Western Europe, and it is the source of the distinctive approach taken by continental law nowadays. Whereas England and the English-speaking world, for the most part, rely on the common law as supplemented by legislation, the European preference is to have everything digested into a code, something like the Companies Act in this country, but something like the Companies Act extended to every area of law. And this is something that can be traced back to Justinian and his law commission, a great and a significant and a very influential achievement. And you will see the ghosts of Justinian in the law codes adopted by the Japanese, by the Chinese, and by the Turks, and by many other non-European peoples. What else did Justinian do? He set the pattern of relations between church and state for the rest of the empire's history. He may be said to have reconquered the richest and most populous of the Western territories, but that is something we'll discuss next week. He began, or he continued and extended a policy of selective fortification and subsidy for the defence of his empire. And he died lonely and embittered, the head of a burned out and vulnerable empire that came close to disintegrating in the 50 years that came after his death. So that is Justinian. Here is the judgment of history, and I will send out the slides so you can read this for yourself. I don't propose to read all of this. But you have two contrasting opinions of Justinian. One from Paul the Deacon, an Italian writer from around 770 AD, who regards Justinian, much as Justinian himself wanted to be regarded, as a man of the utmost brilliance, who presided over a golden age for his empire in every area. Or, on the right-hand panel, you have the opinion of Procopius, the great historian of his reign, a man whom he knew. And here is Procopius writing in his secret history around 560 that Justinian is one of the great destroyers, one of the great monsters of history, the man responsible for every misfortune into which the empire had fallen in his own lifetime. So here are two contrasting judgments of Justinian. One, utterly hostile, written while he was still alive by somebody who knew him. The other, written 200 or so years after his death by someone who was living in a country that had been radically affected by Justinian's policies as emperor. But as I said, you can read those for yourselves. Let's look at the background, however, and the background will take some time to explain. These are images of the Eastern emperors between 395 and 518. You have Arcadius, Theodosius II, Marcian, Leo I. Couldn't find Leo II, but the coin is of Zeno, a barbarian who becomes emperor. And then that ivory diptych portrays Anastasius I, one of the great Pacific emperors. These emperors are reasonably unknown. They did nothing remarkable. They conquered no new provinces. They won no great wars. They did nothing that catches the imagination of history. If you look at the surviving histories of that long century, shall we say 395 to 518, it is a long catalogue of court intrigues and disputes over the nature of Christ. But if these men had no claim to glory, and if they appear to have disclaimed any claim to glory, they do have one thing to be said in their favour. That is, they avoided big wars that would drain the resources of the empire. They ended the growing reliance on barbarian mercenaries for their defence. They presided over a century or so of steady economic expansion and of cultural continuity. The provinces south of the Danube were not always completely secure, and Greece itself was not always secure, but the empire on the whole enjoys an age of peace and prosperity. It is an unexciting and an unambitious long century, which is generally despised by historians of late antiquity or of the early Byzantine Empire. There is nothing heroic about these men or the empire over which they preside. But what they do is they ensure the survival of the empire, and so far as any government is able, or so far as any government at the time was able, they ensure the prosperity and the happiness of their subjects. Here is an approximate map of the world in which the Eastern Empire had to exist. This is notionally dated 423 AD, but from the point of view of the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Empire, it could be any time between 395 and 518. It hardly matters. In the West, you have a crumbling Western Empire. As I said last week, for whatever reason, the West is unable to manage its own defence. The Eastern emperors are willing to subsidize their Western brothers and cousins to the extent that they can have palaces and retinues of eunuchs, and the boilers will work in the winter to keep them warm, and the bath water is hot every day, but they will not subsidize their Western relatives to the extent that they're able to maintain armies of 100,000 men along the Rhine frontier. So to the west, you have the Western Roman Empire, which is, as I keep on saying, in a state of rapid dissolution. To the east, you have the Sassanid, or the Persian Empire, that great red area. The Persian Empire has its own problems. We are unable to speak in any detail about what is happening in the Persian Empire because it's one of those unlucky civilizations that keeps losing all of its records and all of its literature. When Alexander the Great destroyed the first Persian Empire, he also burned the capital, and he burned all the records of Darius and Xerxes, and he appears to have destroyed all written Persian literature. So if you want to understand the Persian Empire in the 6th and the 5th centuries BC, it's necessary to approach the empire through Greek sources, Herodotus for example, and if you want to understand what's happening in the Persian Empire in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries AD, again it's necessary to look to Greek sources, because when this empire was knocked off its perch by the Arab invasions of the 7th century, once again all of the records disappeared. But the Persian Empire appears to have its own problems, and it would like to remain at peace with the Eastern Empire, and the Eastern Empire would like to remain at peace with the Persians. Every so often there are border disputes, but nothing fundamental. No big wars break out until the early years of the 6th century, when both sides aim for limited gains and both sides suffer limited losses. To the north, that blue area, you have the Huns, and for some of the 5th century, the Huns are a serious danger because they have been unified by Attila, and they are an effective and a dangerous enemy, able to break across the Danube at any time of their choice. But for the most part, the Huns can be kept under control by selective bribery, a matter of divide and not rule, but a matter of divide them by bribery and stand back while they fight each other. And if that is not entirely effective, again give them a great sack of gold and point them west. So the Eastern Empire is kept reasonably inviolate in the 5th century. It is able to flourish as much as any civilization was able to flourish at the level of ordinary people before the modern period. Because there are no great wars, because there are no great internal events, the Eastern government is largely concerned with the Monophysite dispute. And I have said, once we move out of late antiquity and into the Byzantine period, you see that religion and politics are indistinguishable. Although this is not something that many modern Christians think about, this was a matter of the utmost importance 1500 years ago. It was a matter of the utmost importance for those people who believed in the various formulations of doctrine, and it was a matter of great importance for whoever wanted to be the government of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Arian dispute, which we discussed last week, covers the relationship between God and Jesus Christ. Is Jesus a creature of God? In which case, Jesus Christ is an inferior creation. He is a created being. Although he is vastly superior to us, he is infinitely inferior to the Father, and so you have a completely undivided Godhead which has created Jesus Christ and sent him to earth to do the things that he did. Or God and Christ are identical. Christ is one with the Father, however you want to express that particular formulation. This was sorted out at the First Council of Nicaea in 324. It was decided that Christ was of the same substance as the Father, but also incarnate in human flesh. That settled the Arian dispute. Arianism continued to flourish among the barbarians for various historical accidents, but it ceased to be a serious problem inside the empire. It certainly ceased to be a problem of any importance in the Eastern Empire. However, once you think that you have defined the relationship between the Father and the Son, the further question arises of the relationship between the Son and humanity. If Christ is of a divine substance but incarnate in flesh, what was the precise nature of this incarnation? You have two extreme points of view to answer this question. The Nestorians, they believe that Christ has two natures, human and divine, which is an answer. The Monophysites, they believe that there is a single divine nature in Christ, and that there is either nothing human, or if there is anything human in the nature of Christ, it is dissolved, as one of the Monophysites claimed, it is dissolved rather as a drop of honey is dissolved in the sea, and therefore, whether in theory or in practice, Christ is essentially divine in every respect, and there is nothing human about him. The incarnation is some kind of projection, a divine projection. Christ was not incarnated as a human being. He was a sort of hologram projected onto earth by God. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 took a sort of middling view, the view of Pope Leo I, which is that Christ is two substances united in a single person. And I say in the slide, please suppress any temptation to laugh or mock or to move on. This is all of critical importance to the unity and indeed the survival of the Eastern Empire. Have a look at this map. This is, so far as we can reconstruct it, a religious map of the Mediterranean world. This is a religious map of the Roman world, shall we say. Let's have a look at it. Those yellow areas, those central yellow areas, are the area of orthodox belief. Those are the areas which accept the formulations of the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. They are orthodox, or they are Catholic. Catholic and orthodox, they can be regarded as one and the same at this time. Notice that except for those areas settled by barbarians or ruled by barbarians, and so you have the Vandals in North Africa, you have the barbarians in Spain, and you have the barbarians, Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, etc. in France. Except for those areas which have been settled or which are simply ruled by barbarians, heresy of any kind is not a problem in the West. If you are a Latin-speaking Christian in the Western Empire, you will be a Catholic, you will look to the Pope as your patriarch, and you will take your lead from Rome. It is a much more complex picture once you move into the East. Notice that what amounts to modern Greece and modern Turkey, those are entirely Orthodox. But they would be entirely Orthodox because they're also entirely or substantially Greek-speaking. But once you move into Egypt and Syria, have a look at those striped areas. Those are areas of Monophysite belief. Those are areas where you have substantial minorities or perhaps majorities who believe in the Monophysite formulation that Christ is entirely divine in his nature. And as I said, these are probable majorities. Greeks in Egypt and Syria dominate the cities, but the cities themselves amount barely to 10% of the overall population. The cities may amount to 5% or 2% for all I know, but the cities are very small and they are dwarfed by the surrounding populations of non-Greeks, of people speaking Syriac, Aramaic, Coptic and other languages which have been reasonably, I won't call them suppressed, languages which have been in obscurity for the past 1,000 years. These are the Monophysite. And then you have other Christian communities beyond the boundaries of the empire to the east. You have Monophysites in Armenia, and you have Nestorians in the Persian Empire proper. This complicates religious policy in Constantinople. The Pope, who is entirely secure, because the Pope presides over a Western Mediterranean world which is of untroubled Orthodox Catholicity. The barbarians are an irritation, but the barbarians themselves are gradually being won over to the Catholic cause. So the Pope has no particular worries about heresy, except that he would like to see it combated. So the Pope is continually leaning on the Eastern Emperor and on Eastern governments. Do something to check the spread of heresy within your territories. As far as the Emperor is concerned, you can't do that. If you lean too hard on the Egyptians and the Syrians, a so far potential tendency to separatism will become actual. These people are drifting out of the imperial orbit. Egypt and Syria were conquered in the 4th century BC by Alexander the Great, and since then, until late antiquity, they have been governed and absolutely dominated by Greek-speaking elites from the cities. But with the spread of Christianity and the growth of national and non-Orthodox churches in Egypt and Syria, these nationalities are beginning to conceive of themselves as separate nations, and they are drifting slowly, in the moral sense at least, out of the imperial orbit. Therefore, the emperors in Constantinople do not want to antagonize the Pope, because the Pope is the supreme bishop with a great deal of authority even in the East. But at the same time, there are very large numbers of taxpayers in Egypt and Syria which are Monophysites. Therefore, the emperors do their best to shut down all dispute over the nature of Christ. They are not interested in persecuting the heretics, but at the same time they are not interested in the open toleration of heresy. And something that must be emphasized is that this is not an age of toleration. The idea that, oh, you're a Monophysite, are you? Fancy that. Well, it doesn't matter. Monophysite bread tastes exactly the same as Catholic bread, so I'll have 2 loaves if you please. It's not that kind of world. It is a world in which it is of the utmost importance that you should believe correctly about the nature of Christ, otherwise you will fall into the pit of hell. A question about the significance of Jerusalem as a city in this period. Jerusalem may have a population of 50,000. It is a city overwhelmingly of Greek speakers. There may be small Jewish communities there, but the Jews were largely dislodged from Jerusalem in AD 70, and certainly after their second uprising in the time of Hadrian. So Jerusalem is a Greek-speaking Christian city. It is mostly Orthodox because it's a city and it's settled by Greek speakers. It has a patriarch. There are, I believe, 5 patriarchs. There is the Patriarch of Rome, of Constantinople, of Antioch, of Jerusalem, and of Alexandria. That's right. And these are the 5 great princes of the church. But of those 5 patriarchs, by general agreement, the senior is the Patriarch of Rome, because he is the direct successor of St. Peter, and he is also the Patriarch of what was for many centuries the capital of the empire. Jerusalem has a patriarch, it has the holy places, it is a place of great religious significance, but it is overwhelmingly Orthodox and Greek-speaking. Coming back to the map, everybody is intolerant, nobody is interested in mutual toleration, but the government in Constantinople needs to keep the Pope and the heretics from becoming too unhappy. It isn't possible to keep both happy, but what you can do is try to keep them from being too unhappy. The working solution is what is called the Henoticon of the Emperor Zeno, issued in 482. This ignores the Pope. It also ignores the requirement to have an ecumenical council before there is any change in doctrine. The emperor, acting on his own motion, condemns both Nestorianism and Monophysitism, but he makes no statement of orthodoxy. And then the law goes on to forbid all public discussion of the issue. The Pope denounces this, the heretics in Egypt and Syria denounce it, everybody denounces everybody else. The Pope actually excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople, but Zeno and his successor Anastasius, they have enough prestige and, when required, enough muscle to insist on having their way. They stop all further discussion in public within their realms of the nature of Christ, and by doing this they suppress open disorder. All this comes to an end in 518. Anastasius dies with, he doesn't lack heirs, he has nephews, but he has no heirs who are regarded as competent to take over the empire. In a palace intrigue, it's hardly the first or the last time that this happens, but in a palace intrigue, his successor is Justin I, who is the elderly and illiterate head of the imperial bodyguard. He is a man of, so far as anyone can tell, zero importance, but effective power falls into the hands of his nephew, Justinian, who is young, who is able, who is ambitious. Indeed, he is Justinian. Justinian has ambitions. He has great plans for the empire. He will unite his empire in religion. He will suppress heresy, and the empire that he rules will be fully orthodox in its faith. He will also be on excellent terms with the Pope in Rome. Therefore, he will begin a settled persecution of heresy in both Syria and Egypt, and will do that regardless of whether it inspires nationalist or separatist tendency in those provinces. He will also, in due course, reconquer the western provinces. These have nearly all fallen into the hands of barbarian warlords. Justinian regards this as a disgrace, and he would like to rule over an empire that is fully orthodox and which also has the same borders it had in the time of Constantine the Great 200 years earlier. For the first 9 years, he can't do much of this because Justin is the emperor and Justinian is simply his nephew, who acts as prime minister but does not have the full authority of emperor. Then in 527, Justin dies. Justinian becomes the emperor, and he is at once able to set to work on realizing his grand ambition. And he has many advantages as he becomes emperor. There have been 4 generations of civil peace in his empire. The religious disputes are by no means settled, but they've largely been suppressed. The empire is, so far as we can tell, in a flourishing condition. To what extent population has been growing or simply recovering, it's impossible to say, but it does look as though this has been an age of economic and demographic expansion, and that anybody coming forward from the 2nd century to the 6th century would travel between Alexandria and Antioch and Ephesus, and would be surprised by many of the changes, would mostly be surprised by the establishment of Christianity, but also be surprised by changes in clothing and changes in architecture, but would not be able to say the world has degenerated since my time. There are fewer people, the cities are smaller, the cities are meaner, there has been a shrinkage of civilization. I don't think anybody brought forward from the time of Marcus Aurelius to the early years of Justinian would see anything amounting to a decline of civilization, however you choose to define it. Let's now look at the second ruler of the age, Theodora, 497 to 548. A very important woman, at least as important as Justinian, and in some respects more important. She was born in 497, so far as we can tell, and this is what has been for 150 years now the largest and richest city in the ancient. It dwarfs all the other great cities of the empire. It's larger than Alexandria, larger than Antioch, larger than Damascus and Corinth. It's larger and richer than Rome itself, certainly larger and richer than Carthage. It is a great city that is heading towards a population of 1 million. The majority in this city is now Greek, and Greek is the only language that you'll hear in most parts of the city. It was founded in the 320s by Constantine, and in the first instance was filled with Latin speakers, but 150 years later it is now overwhelmingly Greek. The administration of the empire is still bilingual, it is still officially in Latin, and there are large numbers of officials who work in Latin, but as soon as they leave their offices and go into the streets, they start speaking their native language, which is Greek. Above this, however, you have a fabulously rich senatorial aristocracy, which is bilingual. It is both Greek and Latin. That is the world into which Theodora is born. I might also add that she's born into a world in which Constantinople, although the largest, is not the only large city. She's born into a family of entertainers. She's the daughter of Acacius, a bear keeper in the Hippodrome, not poor, but humble origins. She goes on the stage at 12. It seems that she was brought up a pagan. Although this is an age that is not at all tolerant, the whole focus of official intolerance is against heresy. Paganism is overlooked, it's ignored, it's not important, it is perceived to be dying out, and if somebody chooses to be a pagan, well, as long as no big fuss is made about it, nothing will be done. The real problem is heresy. There is Theodora. There's the Hippodrome. It's not as big as the Circus Maximus in Rome, which could hold, I believe, 350,000 people, but this great racetrack is able to hold about 200, maybe 250,000 people. It is built on a vast and lavish scale. Look at this monochrome representation of it. You have the imperial box down there at the top right of the circus, and then you have the seating for the people. You have statues and monuments taken from all over the empire. You have an Egyptian obelisk. You have bronze and marble statues taken from all the great pagan temples in the empire. And the Hippodrome itself is at the centre of the vast ceremonial heart of Constantinople. You have the great palace immediately next door. You have the church of Hagia Sophia just a few hundred yards away. You have the Milion, the great milestone, which records the distances from Constantinople to every other large city in the empire. The Hippodrome is a place where chariot races are staged, but it's also a place where you go to watch plays, where you go to watch pantomimes and comic performances of every kind, musical performances. You'll also see public executions. There was, later on in Byzantine history, a barbarian king called Krum, I believe, who was captured and brought back to Constantinople, and he was vivisected to death by the doctors, while a large audience in the Hippodrome looked on at the severing of arteries and the cutting out of organs and whatever else the doctors did to the poor man. This is also the place where the people address the emperor. Remember, the emperor has now become a divine right monarch, and so ordinary people can't go up to him. You can't just bump into the emperor as he wanders around the forum and say, "Oh, there you are. I really wanted to talk to you about the pigeon problem." No, you can't do that. And so if you want to address the emperor, you meet him in the Hippodrome. The emperor will sit in the imperial box and the people will chant at him. Word is put round the various seats and people start chanting. Why is the price of bread so high? Why is there no pork in the shops? We want Paul of Alexandria's head on a plate. Your minister is a beast. You must have him put to death. You are not right to divorce your wife. Your wife is a harlot, or whatever else the audience wants to say. There's safety in numbers. If you have 50,000 people chanting those things, it is difficult to say, have that man beheaded. He insulted me. The emperor can't do that. He has to sit there smiling and speaking back to his people through a herald. So that is the Hippodrome, and Theodora is part of a family which is closely connected with the working of the Hippodrome. There are the bronze horses, now in Venice, but taken from the Hippodrome in the 13th century by the Venetians. They were taken to the Hippodrome in Constantinople, possibly from Rome, but they arrived in Rome probably from Corinth in the 2nd century BC. This is classical Greek work from about the 3rd century BC, maybe a bit earlier, and it's moved around the Mediterranean several times. The majority of their existence, these horses passed in the Hippodrome at Constantinople. There is a representation of the emperor standing in the imperial box, surrounded by the senators, and below them you have the ordinary people. So the Hippodrome is not just a racetrack, it is part of the everyday life of Constantinople. It can even be regarded as part of the imperial constitution, because it is in the Hippodrome that the people and their emperor meet and discuss the issues of the day. Theodora does well. There is on the right a great chunk from Procopius's Secret History, which explains how Theodora was little better than a prostitute, dancing almost naked in the Hippodrome, disporting herself in a manner that Procopius regards as bordering on the obscene. Indeed, Procopius goes on to claim that her private life does more than border on the obscene. Procopius doesn't like Theodora, and so he is not inclined to say anything good about her. But there is no reasonable doubt that she had a somewhat checkered early life, until after 518 she is noticed by Justinian, who is not yet the emperor, but it's obvious that he will soon be the emperor. He falls deeply in love with her, and he marries her. But you see, she is an actress. Indeed, well, she's an actress in every possible sense. And there are ancient laws dating back to the time of Augustus himself against marriage between senators and actresses. Therefore, if Justinian is to do other than keep Theodora as a concubine, which would be perfectly acceptable in law and according to the social values of the day, it is necessary to change an ancient law so that he can marry her. But the great love that Justinian has for Theodora is such that he is able to prevail on his uncle and change the law so that he can marry Theodora, which is what he does. They are crowned together as emperor and empress in 527. It is not the case that Justinian is the emperor and Theodora is a decorative consort, someone who smiles and nods and receives delegations of schoolboys with bunches of flowers. Theodora is the co-ruler of the empire. They are crowned together by the Patriarch of Constantinople as the emperor and empress, and they work together to rule the empire. Theodora is a member of the imperial cabinet. That is, she is a member of the private council that meets with the emperor. She receives foreign ambassadors. She corresponds with foreign rulers. She does this without any particular objection from the ruling class of the Eastern Empire. The point is that she is the wife of the emperor and she is efficient in everything that she does. It seems that although in public Justinian was strongly committed to the suppression of heresy within the empire, Theodora had a moderating influence on her husband. It seems that there was a tacit or an explicit arrangement between husband and wife. Justinian makes laws to suppress the Monophysite heresy throughout the empire, but chiefly in Egypt and Syria. Theodora quietly makes sure that those laws are not enforced. She protects the Monophysites in the majority areas. She also protects them in Constantinople itself. There is also a claim in Procopius, who is not an entirely impartial historian of the woman because he doesn't like her, but there is a claim in Procopius that Theodora set up a refuge for reformed prostitutes. It was probably a good idea at the outset. Prostitution is a most degrading occupation, and I'm sure it's deeply unpleasant. And I'm sure that there are many women who would like to get out of it. The empress sets up a refuge for former prostitutes, somewhere they can go, where they can find a bed and where they can eat and where they can earn their bread in some less disreputable manner. It seems that the refuge that Theodora set up was little better than a prison, where they grew so bored that they would despair and throw themselves from the high windows of the refuge. Many of these rescued prostitutes committed suicide rather than be rescued, but that is a claim by Procopius. But Theodora also takes a very firm line against formal insubordination. If you don't want to obey the emperor on the quiet, she will turn her blind eye to it. But if somebody openly disobeys the emperor, then she will see to it that he's punished. And she does this in 537 with the Pope. Pope Silverius, it's something I'll discuss next week, but he is discussing his own peace terms with the Goths in 537. This is regarded as treason against the emperor, and so Silverius is arrested in the Lateran Palace. A file of imperial soldiers march into the Lateran Church in Rome. They arrest the Pope. They bundle him off to Ostia, stick him on a ship, and the next thing he knows, he's in Constantinople being shouted at by the emperor and is dumped in a monastery somewhere off the Black Sea. Theodora was a woman who was not to be tangled with. She died in 548, possibly of cancer, and is buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles with the other emperors. Now that's the summary of who Theodora was and what she did. Let's now look at the most famous event in her life, the Nika Riots. Justinian takes control of the empire in 527. He immediately puts the whole empire on a war footing, which means that taxes go up. The taxes go up, and the privileges of the people of Constantinople, namely the free distributions of food, which are no longer confined simply to a monthly handout of corn, but also include rations of olive oil and pork and other nice things. Those are cut. Also, the price of entry to the bathhouses is increased. The government cuts spending and raises taxes in order to finance a forward policy in the Western Mediterranean, and this causes immediate unpopularity. In 532, the blue and the green circus factions, and these are like rival football teams, but they're like rival football teams and their fans, which have a semi-official standing in the constitution. In 532, the two circus factions, the blues and the greens, unite, and they begin a riot that begins in the Hippodrome. It begins with a set of demands to the emperor. We want John of Cappadocia removed because he is the most rapacious head of finance we've ever known. We want him gone. We want these other reforms. The emperor says, I'll think about it. The mob is not, or the people of Constantinople are not convinced. The blue and the green factions continue demonstrating. This turns into a riot. It spills out of the Hippodrome into the entire ceremonial heart of Constantinople. The factions demand the dismissal of unpopular ministers, and then they go one step further. They demand the abdication of Justinian in favour of the nephews of Anastasius, the last of the peaceful emperors. It seems that the people of Constantinople, the people themselves outside the capital, don't matter. We have no idea what they think, but it's not particularly important. The people of Constantinople demand the abdication of the emperor. Justinian himself seems to have despaired. He was ready to abdicate and take ship for the west. But then Theodora, she steps in. There is a meeting of the imperial cabinet in the palace. Justinian says, there's nothing for it. I've got to go. I'm going west. It seems that Procopius was present at this meeting, or he spoke to people who were present. Here is his account of what Theodora said to Justinian. Every man who is born into the light of day must sooner or later die. And how could an emperor ever allow himself to be a fugitive? May I myself never willingly shed my imperial robes, nor see the day when I am not addressed by my title. If you, my lord, wish to save your skin, you will have no difficulty doing so. As for me, I stand by the ancient saying, the purple is the noblest winding sheet. That is what Procopius records, and something like that, I have no doubt, is spoken. This puts a backbone into Justinian. He turns to his great military friend Belisarius and says, can you turn things round? And Belisarius says, yes, give me some soldiers and I'll certainly turn things round. That is what Justinian allows. Belisarius leads a small army into the Hippodrome and starts a massacre in which 30,000 people may have died. He then retakes the centre of the city in bloody street fighting, during which large parts of the centre of Constantinople, as built by Constantine, are set on fire or otherwise reduced to rubble. The circus factions are humbled, the streets are filled with dead bodies and running with blood, but Justinian is still the emperor, his policies remain in place, he is now absolutely in charge. And here is the greatest monument of his victory over the circus factions, because the Holy Wisdom Church is destroyed in the rioting, and Justinian decides that a much larger church will be built on its site. It will be the largest and the most spectacular church in the world. Over the next few years, he plunders the empire, or rather, he mines the pagan temples throughout the empire. The great bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia church are taken from a temple in Ephesus. The columns that support this great freestanding dome, those are taken from, I believe, Antioch. And so it goes on. The church is put together in double quick time with building materials taken from all over the empire, repurposed building materials. He gives a free hand to his architect Anthemius. What is built remains one of the most spectacular buildings in the world. It is one of the largest covered areas. It is, I believe, the largest freestanding dome. It remains the largest or the most spectacular or what have you. It continues to attract its superlatives. It is a very cleverly built church. That being said, in the first instance, the dome is far too ambitious and collapses within 50 years and needs to be rebuilt and reinforced. And then about 700 years later, in the 13th century, the weight of the dome at last begins to push the walls outwards, so that the whole structure seems likely to collapse. By now, however, Constantinople is ruled by the Franks. It is now ruled by Westerners, and they use their own architectural skills to build those great buttresses that you see outside the Hagia Sophia. Those were built by the Crusaders when they ruled Constantinople, and those stabilized the church and have kept it stable since. But that is the beginnings of the reign of Justinian. What he's done is he's taken complete power. He has humbled the circus factions, which have been a serious problem for the imperial government for a long time. He has worked out a pattern of selective toleration and persecution of heresy that keeps the Pope happy and keeps the Monophysites in Syria and Egypt from open rebellion. He is now cashing in the gains from a long century of peace and prosperity and general expansion in order to reach out into the West, to reconquer North Africa and Italy and maybe France and maybe Spain, and to reunite the entire Roman Empire under his leadership. And it looks for a while as though he will do it, but unfortunately it doesn't all go to plan. And so I'll stop there. I've said as much as I can in these slides, and what I will talk about next week, I'll talk about the Reconquest, I'll talk about the Persian Wars, and I'll talk about the series of great disasters over which Justinian had no control, but disasters which frustrated all of his plans and which plunged the entire Mediterranean world into a series of crises from which you can date the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. But that's all I have to say for the moment, so Are there any questions